My name is Elijah Moses Beaumont, and I want to tell you something about the way certain men look at you when they have already decided what you are. It is not a hostile look. Hostile, you can work with. Hostile means they see you as a threat, and a threat is something they have to reckon with. No, the look I am talking about is softer than that. It is a look of mild amusement, patient, almost kind. The way a man looks at a child who is trying to explain something complicated. It says, without saying a single word out loud, I hear you talking, I just don't think it counts. I received that look for the first time in 1974, when I was 22 years old, and walked into the offices of Whitmore and Crane Architecture on the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree Street in Atlanta, with a portfolio under my arm that I had stayed up 4 consecutive nights assembling. I was the first black architect to apply at that firm in its 31-year history. The senior partner, a man named Douglas Whitmore, shook my hand warmly. He complimented my work. He said the firm was always looking for talented people. He offered me a drafting position, entry level, the same position they offered new graduates with no experience. I had a master's degree from Georgia Tech and 3 years of postgraduate apprenticeship work behind me. I smiled, I thanked him. I took the job, because here's what I understood at 22 that took some men twice my age to learn. The room you are standing in is rarely the room that matters. The room that matters is the one they have not yet thought to lock. I want to tell you who I built myself into before I tell you what they tried to do to me, because the two things cannot be separated. I grew up in Vine City on the west side of Atlanta, in a shotgun house on Chapel Road with my mother, my grandmother, and 2 younger sisters. My father left when I was 9, not dramatically. He just went to the store one Thursday evening, and the store got farther and farther away until eventually it was in another state entirely. My grandmother, Nettie, filled that space. She was a stout, serious woman who had cleaned offices in downtown Atlanta for 30 years and who treated work the way other people treat religion. Sacred, non-negotiable. She cleaned those offices at night, but during the day she drew pencil sketches of buildings she saw on her walk to the bus stop. Careful, precise drawings in a series of brown notebooks she kept under her bed. She never had the word for what she was doing, she just called it her noticing. When I was 12, she handed me one of those notebooks and told me to start my own noticing. I never stopped. By the time I graduated from Morehouse and then Georgia Tech, I had filled 47 notebooks. Buildings, structures, load-bearing ideas I did not yet have the technical language for but could feel the logic of in my bones. My grandmother died the year I finished my master's degree. I kept all 47 notebooks in a fireproof box under my drafting table for the next 40 years. I still have them. At Whitmore and Crane, I spent 3 years drawing other men's ideas with my name on nothing. I watched junior white associates get their initials attached to projects. I watched concepts I had quietly introduced in team meetings show up in presentation decks under someone else's signature. I said nothing. I was learning the building from the inside, the way you have to learn any structure before you can know where the weight truly sits. In 1977, I left and started my own firm with a man named Curtis Webb, who I had met at Georgia Tech and who was the best structural engineer I had ever worked with. We called the firm Beaumont and Webb. We operated out of a converted garage in Decatur with 2 drafting tables, a coffee pot that never fully worked, and a client list that in the beginning consisted entirely of small black-owned businesses in the southwest Atlanta neighborhoods the big firms ignored because the contracts were not large enough to bother with. We designed barbershops and dental offices and a beautiful small church on Cascade Road that still stands today. We charged fair rates. We delivered on time. We treated every $40,000 contract with the same seriousness we would have brought to a $40 million one, because that is how you build a reputation that does not need advertising. By 1985, Beaumont and Webb had grown into a firm of 22 people and was beginning to attract significant commercial work. By 1990, we had designed 2 mid-rise office buildings in Midtown and won a regional AIA award that put our name in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for the first time. That was the year the Hargrove brothers came to see us. Davis and Mitchell Hargrove were third-generation Atlanta real estate developers. Their grandfather had built tract housing in Cobb County after World War II. Their father had moved the family into commercial development in the 1960s. By the time Davis and Mitchell inherited the company, Hargrove Development Group was a significant player in the Atlanta market with a portfolio of office parks, retail centers, and a growing interest in mixed-use urban development. They were not bad men. I want to be precise about that because the story I am telling you is not about bad men. It is about ordinary men doing ordinary things that only become visible as damage when you add them all up across 30 years and lay them end to end on a table. Davis was the older one, serious, strategic, a man who thought about legacy in the same way I did, though for different reasons. Mitchell was looser, a glad-hander, the kind of man who remembered your birthday and your wife's name and called you brother after 2 drinks. They came to us because they had a problem. They were bidding on the Anchor Commission for a new mixed-use development at the southern end of downtown Atlanta, a project that would eventually become what people in this city know today as the Hargrove Civic Quarter. 11 city blocks, residential towers, a hotel, a public market, green space, a performing arts facility. The kind of project that defines a skyline for a generation. The city had made it clear quietly that the commission would not go to a firm without meaningful black ownership and creative leadership. Atlanta in 1990 had a black mayor, a black majority city council, and a procurement culture that took those requirements seriously. Davis Hargrove looked across my conference table and told me he wanted a partnership. Beaumont and Webb as the lead architect of record on the Civic Quarter, full creative control, our name on the building. Curtis and I spent 2 weeks reviewing the proposed partnership structure. We negotiated hard. We brought in our own attorney. We came out with a contract that gave Beaumont and Webb architectural primacy, creative approval rights on all major design decisions, and a fee structure that reflected our actual value to the project. What the contract did not adequately protect, and what I will carry as my one professional regret for the rest of my life, was the intellectual property on the design work itself. We were so focused on fee structures and approval rights that we treated the IP provisions as boilerplate. Our attorney flagged it. I told him it was standard industry language and moved on. That was the only door I left unlocked. The Civic Quarter took 4 years to complete. It was the finest work of my professional life. The performing arts building at the heart of the complex, a structure I designed over 6 weeks of almost sleepless work with those 47 notebooks spread across my studio floor, won the AIA's National Honor Award in 1996. The citation called it a masterwork of civic architecture that synthesized vernacular Southern form with modernist structural logic. My grandmother's noticing, rendered in steel and glass and red Georgia brick, standing 11 stories tall in the middle of Atlanta. Hargrove Development Group became one of the most respected firms in the Southeast on the strength of that project. Davis and Mitchell parlayed the Civic Quarter into a decade of premium commissions. Our partnership continued through 3 more major projects over the following 10 years. In 2003, Curtis Webb retired. He moved to Savannah to build a sailboat and eat shrimp, which is exactly what Curtis had always said he was going to do and which I respected completely. I restructured the firm as Beaumont Architecture Group and we continued. Davis Hargrove retired in 2007. Mitchell stayed on and brought his 2 sons, Tanner and Breck, into the business. Tanner was the older one, an MBA from Emory, aggressive and transactional in a way his father had never been. Breck was quieter, more technically minded, and the 2 of them together began reshaping Hargrove Development into something harder and faster than what Davis had built. I worked less with them than I had with Davis and Mitchell. The relationship was cordial but thinner. I was in my late 50s by then, winding down toward a transition of my own, thinking about what I wanted the firm to become after me. I should have been paying closer attention to what the Hargrove brothers were thinking about too. In the spring of 2019, Tanner Hargrove called me to a lunch at the Capitol City Club. He was 41. He had his father's handsome face and none of his father's patience. He ordered a $60 steak and told me that Hargrove Development was planning to sell. A private equity group out of New York, a firm called Meridian Landmark Partners, was acquiring regional development companies with strong brand portfolios in growing Sun Belt markets. They had approached Hargrove. The number on the table was significant. Tanner told me the sale would include the full Hargrove portfolio and brand. He told me this as a courtesy, he said, out of respect for the long relationship. He did not ask me a single question about Beaumont Architecture Group. He did not mention our firm at all after that sentence. I ate my lunch. I asked a few polite questions about the timeline. I wished him well. We shook hands at the valet stand in the warm Georgia afternoon, and I watched him drive away in a white Range Rover. I sat in my car in the parking deck for about 10 minutes. Then I called my attorney, a woman named Adrienne Acaffer, who had been handling my business affairs for 15 years and who I trusted more than almost anyone alive. I told her what Tanner had said. Then I told her what Tanner had not said. What Tanner had not said was this: Meridian Landmark Partners was not buying Hargrove Development for its land holdings or its management contracts or its current project pipeline. They were buying it primarily for what the investment prospectus, which I had not yet seen but which I was already certain existed, described as the firm's flagship design legacy, the Hargrove Civic Quarter. The award-winning architecture, the brand identity built on 30 years of built work that I had designed. Adrienne was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me one question. She asked if I still had the original project files. Here is something most people outside the architecture and construction industry do not know. Architectural drawings are not just plans, they are intellectual property. The design concepts embedded in those drawings, the specific creative choices, the spatial logic, the formal language of a building, those belong to whoever originated them, not automatically to whoever paid for them. The default ownership rules in architecture are more nuanced than in most fields, and they depend almost entirely on what the contract says. Most contracts in 1990 said what the Hargrove contract said, which was not enough. But here is what the contract had also not addressed: the conceptual design documents, the preliminary sketches, the design development drawings that preceded the construction documents. The work that existed before the project was formally contracted, the exploratory design work I had brought to the table as part of the original pitch. I had 47 years of notebooks and 30 years of project files stored in a climate-controlled archive room in my office on Auburn Avenue. I had the original concept sketches for the Performing Arts Building, dated and witnessed, predating the signed partnership agreement by 6 weeks. More importantly, I had something Tanner Hargrove had apparently completely forgotten about. In 2004, during a contract renewal negotiation between Beaumont Architecture Group and Hargrove Development, Adrienne had pushed through a clause that neither Davis Hargrove nor his attorneys had objected to because it had seemed, at the time, like standard professional language. The clause stated that all primary design authorship of completed projects remained the intellectual property of the originating architect of record, and that any commercial use of those designs, including reproduction, replication, licensing, sale, or transfer, required the written consent of Beaumont Architecture Group. It had been sitting in a file folder for 15 years. Adrienne found it in 40 minutes. She called me back, and her voice had a particular quality in it that I had only heard a handful of times over 15 years. Quiet, careful. The voice of someone holding a very large, very fragile thing. She told me we needed to meet in person. The Meridian Landmark Partners acquisition prospectus was 112 pages long. Adrienne obtained a copy through a contact at a law firm that did peripheral work on the deal. I read it over one weekend at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad beside me. Meridian was paying $340 million for Hargrove Development Group. The prospectus dedicated 11 pages to what it called the firm's design heritage portfolio. It listed 7 flagship projects by name. The Hargrove Civic Quarter led the list. The Performing Arts Building was described as one of the most recognized pieces of civic architecture in the American Southeast and a cornerstone of the Hargrove brand identity. The word Beaumont appeared exactly 0 times in those 11 pages. In the section describing the brand assets being transferred, the prospectus listed original architectural drawings, design documentation, and associated intellectual property for all flagship projects as included assets in the sale. They were selling my work. They were selling my grandmother's noticing, formalized into steel and glass and 30 years of professional reputation, and my name was not on a single page of the transaction. I set the prospectus down on my kitchen table. I looked out the window at the backyard, at the dogwood tree I had planted the year we finished the Civic Quarter. It was April and the tree was in full bloom. I thought about Douglas Whitmore shaking my hand in 1974 with that patient, mild look on his face. I thought about every meeting where I had watched my ideas migrate across a conference table and come back to me under a different name. I thought about my grandmother drawing buildings she would never be allowed to enter in brown notebooks nobody would ever publish. Then I picked up the phone and called Adrienne and told her to proceed. Adrienne filed a formal intellectual property claim against Hargrove Development Group on a Tuesday morning in June. The claim asserted that the proposed sale of design documentation and associated IP for 6 of the 7 projects listed in the Meridian prospectus constituted an unauthorized commercial transfer of intellectual property belonging to Beaumont Architecture Group under the 2004 contract clause. The 7th project, a suburban office park that a junior associate had primarily designed, we left out of it deliberately. Precision matters in legal work. You do not claim what you cannot prove, and you do not dilute a strong case by overreaching. Tanner Hargrove called me that same afternoon. He did not use his father's warm voice. He told me this was an overreach. He told me the 2004 clause had been boilerplate and that no court would enforce it the way I was reading it. He told me I was going to damage a 30-year relationship over a misunderstanding. I let him finish. Then I told him very calmly that the claim was not a negotiating position. It was a legal fact. and that Meridian Landmark Partners had been formally notified of the pending claim that morning and had responded within 2 hours by placing the acquisition in escrow pending resolution. $340 million frozen. Tanner stopped talking. I told him I would be available to discuss a resolution through our respective attorneys. Then I ended the call. What happened over the following 6 weeks was not what Tanner expected. He expected me to want money, a settlement, a number I would take to go away and let the deal close. That is the calculation most people make when they see a 70-year-old man who came from Vine City and spent his career being overlooked. They assume the goal is always a check. They assume you want a piece of what they are building. What I wanted was different. I wanted my name on my work, not symbolically, legally, permanently. Adrian presented our terms to Hargrove's attorneys on a Wednesday morning in a conference room on the 32nd floor of a building downtown. I had designed that building in 1998. My name was not on the lobby directory. Our terms were as follows. First, all 6 flagship projects in the Meridian prospectus would be formally redocumented with Beaumont Architecture Group as architect of record and primary design author. This documentation would be filed with the AIA, with the City of Atlanta, and with the permanent project records held by each building's current owner or manager. Second, the Meridian acquisition prospectus would be amended to correctly attribute design authorship. The Hargrove brand narrative in all marketing materials, presentations, and public communications going forward would accurately reflect the role of Beaumont Architecture Group in the creation of the firm's design legacy. Third, a licensing fee, structured as a percentage of the Meridian acquisition price, would be paid to Beaumont Architecture Group for the commercial transfer of design documentation and IP. Adrian had set that number at 4% of the total acquisition value, 4% of $340 million. I want to be honest with you about something. The money was not the point. But I also want to be honest that the money was not nothing. 4% of that number was enough to fully endow the scholarship program I had been quietly building for architecture students from underserved Atlanta neighborhoods for the past decade. It was enough to fund that program for 30 years without me having to raise another dollar. It was enough to put the names of young people who grew up in neighborhoods like Vine City onto buildings in cities they had not yet imagined living in. That was worth every second of what came next. Tanner's first response was to go over my head. He called Mitchell, his father, retired and living on a golf course in Sea Island. Mitchell called me personally, which I respected. He used his father's voice this time, warm and a little tired, the voice of a man who had watched his sons become harder versions of himself and had some feelings about it he could not quite say out loud. He told me the deal was the family's legacy. He told me 30 years of partnership meant something to him. He told me he hoped we could find a way through this that did not end badly for everyone. I told Mitchell that I had enormous respect for him and for the work we had built together. I told him that the terms Adrian had presented were not punitive. I told him that the only thing I was asking for was accurate credit for work I had done. I told him that if the Hargrove legacy was genuinely built on that work, then correctly attributing that work would not diminish the legacy. It would tell the true story of it. Mitchell was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Eli, if I had been paying attention, we would have done right by you a long time ago." I told him I believed him. Then I told him that doing right by me now was still available. Tanner's second response was to hire a litigation firm and file a countermotion arguing that the 2004 clause was unenforceable. His attorneys were good. They found 3 angles of attack on the language that were not frivolous. This was going to be a real fight if it went to court. What Tanner did not know was that I had known it would be a real fight since the Tuesday morning Adrian filed the claim. We had prepared for that. We had prepared for something else too. The week after Tanner filed his countermotion, Adrian contacted the editorial team at Architectural Record, which is the most widely read professional architecture publication in the country. She sent them the original concept sketches for the Hargrove Civic Quarter Performing Arts Building, dated, documented, pre-contract. She sent them the AIA award citation, which named me as the design architect. She sent them a carefully written summary of the IP dispute. She also contacted the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and the Georgia chapter of the AIA, and 3 architecture schools, including Georgia Tech, whose alumni newsletter had been asking me for an interview for 2 years. I want to be precise about what I am telling you here. I did not leak anything. I did not make accusations in the press. Every piece of information Adrian shared was documented, accurate, and part of the public record of a legal dispute. But the architecture and design community is not large, and the story of a 70-year-old black architect whose landmark work was about to be sold in a $340 million transaction with his name stripped out of it was the kind of story that moved through that community at a speed that surprised even me. Within 10 days, Meridian Landmark Partners had received formal letters of concern from the AIA's National Ethics Board and from the Dean of Architecture at Georgia Tech. 3 prominent architecture critics had published pieces about design attribution and the erasure of black authorship in the built environment. A professor at Harvard's GSD who had taught the Civic Quarter as a case study for 20 years had posted a lengthy thread about it that had been shared several thousand times. None of this was about the money, it was about the record. And the record, it turned out, mattered enormously to Meridian Landmark Partners because Meridian was not just buying a real estate company. They were buying a design brand. And a design brand with a contested, disputed, racially charged IP claim sitting on top of its flagship asset was not worth $340 million to a New York private equity firm that had LPs to answer to and a board that read the news. Meridian's lead partner called Tanner Hargrove on a Thursday afternoon and told him the deal would not close under the current conditions. He had 30 days to resolve the IP claim cleanly and completely, or Meridian would walk. Tanner called Adrian the next morning. We settled on a Monday in late August. Atlanta was hot the way Atlanta is only hot in late August, the kind of heat that sits on the city like a hand pressing down. I wore a light gray suit. Adrian wore a blue dress. We rode the elevator up together, and she handed me a coffee from the lobby cart and told me to let her do the talking until it was time for me to do the talking. Tanner sat across the table with 2 attorneys and his brother Breck, who had stayed quiet through most of the preceding weeks and who looked, honestly, like a man relieved that something was finally being resolved. He had his grandfather's face more than his father's. He nodded at me when I sat down, a small nod, the kind that carries actual weight. The settlement terms were what we had originally proposed, adjusted slightly on the licensing fee structure at Adrian's suggestion to reflect a phased payment that made it easier for Hargrove to manage through the acquisition timeline. Every flagship project correctly attributed, all 6, filed with the AIA, the city, and the project records. The Meridian prospectus amended, the Hargrove brand narrative corrected. A licensing fee that, when the acquisition closed 60 days later, funded the Beaumont Architecture Scholarship in full. And one additional item that had not been in the original terms, because Breck Hargrove had asked to add it personally the week before the settlement meeting. A permanent installation in the lobby of the Performing Arts Building at the Civic Quarter. A bronze panel, 12 inches by 18 inches, set into the west wall beside the main entrance where every person who walks into that building will see it from the moment they come through the door. It reads the Hargrove Civic Quarter Performing Arts Center, designed by Elijah Moses Beaumont, FAIA, Beaumont Architecture Group, Atlanta, Georgia, completed 1995. AIA National Honor Award 1996, in honor of Nettie Beaumont, who taught her grandson to notice. I was at the installation on a Friday morning in November. The crew had the panel mounted by 10 o'clock. I stood in the lobby afterward for a long time looking at it. A young woman came through the main entrance while I was standing there, maybe 20 years old, backpack on, headphones around her neck. She stopped to look at the panel the way young people stop for things that catch their eye unexpectedly. She read it. She looked up at the building around her, the soaring atrium, the light coming through the clear-story windows the way I had planned it to come 30 years ago. She looked back at the panel, then she took a picture of it with her phone and walked on. I thought about what she might do with that picture, who she might show it to, whether somewhere in her life was a notebook full of drawings that did not yet have a name. I thought about my grandmother on her walk to the bus stop with a pencil in her coat pocket. I walked out into the November morning. Atlanta was cool and bright. The dogwood trees along the plaza were bare. The city was going about its business around the building I had designed and which now, finally, carried my name. I had one call to make. I dialed Adrian. She picked up on the second ring. I told her it looked good. She said she knew it would. I told her to send the first scholarship disbursements. She said they were already sent. I stood on the plaza for another minute, looking up at the building. 11 stories of red Georgia brick and glass and the specific logic of load and light that I had worked out in a studio 30 years ago with my grandmother's notebook spread across the floor. Then I put my phone in my pocket and walked to my car. The work was done. The record was correct. The names were in the right places. That is all I ever wanted. I want to say something directly to anyone watching this who has spent years doing work that carried someone else's name. You are not invisible because you are small. You are invisible because somebody decided it was convenient to look through you. Those are not the same thing. Document everything. Date everything. The contract clause that saves you is the one you negotiated 15 years ago when nobody thought it would ever matter. The drawing that proves your case is the one you kept in a fireproof box because your grandmother taught you that what you make with your hands belongs to you. Reputation is not given, it is recorded, and the recording, if you do it right, outlasts everyone who tried to erase it. My name is on that building now. It will be on that building long after I am gone, and long after Tanner Hargrove has forgotten this ever happened. That is not revenge, that is the truth, finally standing up straight.